Hello. In this episode, we're going to look more deeply at the question of the design of population policy. For the most part, this still relates to low-income countries that continue to have high fertility, not perhaps as high as it was 2 or 3 decades ago, but nonetheless remains higher than seen as effective or desirable from the social point of view. And so we will look then at policies that address this question. Briefly, however, at the end of this episode, we'll look at something beginning to face a number of developing countries, China in particular, in which the fertility decline has reached a point of being below replacement to where the size of the retired population becomes quite large in relation to the working population, where the working population starts to decline, and indeed, ultimately, overall population starts to decline. But this is a problem far removed from the low-income countries, and especially the least-income countries, as well as many lower middle-income countries. And so when we want to talk about the rationale for any kind of policy, but population policy in particular, we want to begin with the question, what is it that makes policy important in this case? Sometimes it's simply for good social reasons such as lowering inequality or empowering women as a goal and value in itself. When the goal and stated goal is to raise efficiency, one needs to ask the question, are there market failures? Because as we know, when markets are working well, the result is efficiency. So always in these kinds of cases, we need to ask this question. We'll have to do the same at several points later in the course, such as when we look, for example, at whether there should be migration policy. And so there are some clear market failures nonetheless with respect to high fertility, high births per woman, resulting in increases in population, possibly rapid increases in population. In the previous episode, we looked at one of these in detail, namely coordination failures, our figure 4.1 reinterpreted, in which we looked at the case in which a key factor involving how people make decisions about how many children to have in their family will depend upon what others are doing. So that we could be stuck in an equilibrium that's a poor one from the point of view of those involved in the villages, stuck in an equilibrium in which there's high births per woman when the local preference really would be for a lower number of births per woman, such as 2. In addition, there are several other market failures and other impediments that are worth talking about and can be quite important. One is environmental impacts. When there's rapid population growth, this often occurs in rural areas, and this can put rapid pressures as a result on the environment. We can see farmers looking for new farmland, pushing into more fragile areas. We can see very intensive, indeed what we think of as overuse of farmland, as the quality of the soil fails, is less productive, as water tables fall, and so that we face environmental impacts of rapid population growth or just of high population. There could be urban impacts as well. Imperfect information is another important aspect. This can include, among other things, information lags. And so that it may be that the experience of the older adults has been that child mortality is very high. And so even though conditions may have changed, that may be the wisdom that's getting passed on to the next generation. And things look good now, but historically things are not so good, so you should be prepared and have a lot of children, as a result. Other kinds of imperfect information can be important. Information about contraceptives would be another example in which just sharing of information costs something, but is likely to have benefits. In 2020, in October of 2020, the Nobel laureates in economics didn't work on any problem that seems related to this. However, they did relate to issues in the economics of information. We think of it as of their work as being an auction, but Paul Milgram and Robert Wilson actually worked more generally in problems of imperfect information. Financial market failures can also be important because of the fact that we've thought of the families in part making decisions about how many children to have so that they can have old age security. Of course, it costs money to raise children. So it might be that if there were savings institutions in place, at least more effective savings institutions and in the right place, near where the people live, for example, that instead of having more children, they might save more. So financial market failures, including the non-existence of markets in some areas, may be another important market failure. And sociological factors also play a role, but we can analyze these also in economic terms, as we have been, such as social norms and status that can go into the question of what is expected with, in terms of what others are doing. Status can be important. When women's status is higher, it can also lead to less births per woman, since women in general seem, according to surveys, to prefer a smaller number of children than do men, wives as compared to husbands. And there can be other examples, external costs imposed by individual family status seeking to gain status by the size of one's family, which among other things can also mean that you can farm and occupy larger tracts of land. So then, responses in terms of policy, as we looked to some extent at in previous episode, fertility can be lowered with improved women's education role and status, as we talked about, as well as having higher female non-agricultural wages. Taken together, they refer to the possibility of doing outside work and having this wage employment, raising incomes, increasing the opportunity costs of time raising children. Women's education also does that, leads potentially to higher wages and new perspectives, and role and status as being more than just mothers and also having the status to make decisions. So a key fact is that women's opportunity cost of time is possibly the most important determinant of fertility, just statistically speaking. A rise in family income levels through shared growth, among other things, we know that this can enable families to substitute child quality for child quantity. It can also make it possible to think about saving rather than depending upon your children to take care of you when you're old. Reduction in infant mortality, and I should really say child mortality under 5 and child mortality in general, and better health care. This reduces, among other things, the incentive to have more children on the fear that some will die. So that development of old age and social security plans can also be important, especially where incomes are not rising fast enough or financial markets are not working well enough. But nonetheless, this is another thing that is a policy that also directly relates, very specifically and directly relates to some of the analysis that's gone through in terms of trying to understand what causes high fertility. Expand schooling opportunities, for example, schools in more villages, closer to home, including high schools, and lowered real costs, including eliminating tuition for high schools. This enables parents to send kids to school, obviously, but this means an opportunity to substitute this child quality over child quantity. Lowered prices and better information on contraceptives, direct incentives such as subsidy benefits. This is something seen in the case of China, in which, in addition to making more than one, in some cases more than 2 children illegal, there was the extra kick, if you want, of giving special subsidies to families who had only 1 child for that child to go to school, If you had an additional child, those earlier subsidies disappear. And then policies that have the effect of reducing boy preference. And overall, this provides a list that is a framework for policy. The implications of the microeconomic analysis tell us where to look for policies that could be effective, where to study whether such policies are effective or can be designed in a way to become more effective. There's a new population challenge now, and that is that there's below replacement fertility. Some middle-income countries now already have fewer than 2 births per woman. And so the result is that populations will begin declining before they reach high income. A key example is that China's working age population has already begun to fall. Births per woman has been below 2, or below 2.05 or below 201 replacement fertility for long enough now that we've actually gotten to the point where working age population is declining. That's described in box 6.3 in chapter 6. Transition countries, former Soviet sphere countries, include several middle income countries facing similar issues. Here's a list. It includes Russia itself, along with Moldova and Albania, Armenia, and some others. Some other countries that either are or are very likely on current trends to be facing this problem have in recent years had fertility rates of below 2 per woman, include Brazil, Cuba, Iran, Lebanon, Mauritius, St. Lucia, and Thailand. This is a very diverse group of countries that suggests there's nothing very specific or peculiar, for example, about Europe or East Asia. This could be a more general issue. In China, the situation is known as the problem of getting old before getting rich. But that's a kind of general way of applying the problem for all countries. It's a kind of slogan or bumper sticker about this question. What does one do in such cases? A problem in this respect is a high dependency burden in reverse. In the lower income countries, the issue is that you may grow more slowly because a lot of the population is too young to work. Here, in these cases, a large fraction of the population will be too old to work. And here, incomes of the working age population will be insufficient to support the retirees, or insufficient to leave sufficient savings so that there can be investment in new productive activities. And with below replacement fertility, there's also a reverse demographic momentum that occurs, sort of the opposite of the population pyramid. That is to say, even if after a couple of generations there's a return to replacement fertility, there still will be declines in population for a while as these smaller cohorts work their way through the life cycle. So that's a reverse of the condition of population momentum that we looked up in terms of the population pyramids. So finally, I would just like to take a quick look at some policies that have been proposed for situations of population declines. Some of them work together. Allow immigration. This is a no-brainer. This is such an obvious thing to do, but so many countries have found this very difficult, including China and Japan and South Korea. But it's more general, and of course, even countries that are high income, the US, several European countries have had significant social strains over immigration. But it's one ready solution. Second, retrain workers so that they can work in their older age, and to have the skills that an economy, if it's successfully developing, will need higher levels of skill to work with more advanced technology. This also seems like a very good strategy. Third, moving up the value chain, try to find some ways to produce products of higher productivity, get a market for such products to support a larger non-working population. With higher income per worker, that is a substitute for having fewer workers. Fourth, and this is related as well, attract foreign investment, not just of any kind, but of the kind that can help transfer to your country the types of skills that will be effective in raising productivity and incomes. So you see that all of these kinds of policies are consistent. They're mutually consistent or complementary. They work best in tandem. The last policy, sometimes called the last resort, is pronatal incentives. Try to encourage people to have more children. And so this can be done and has been done with special tax breaks. This is historically something that's been tried in countries such as France in past decades. Well, these cause significant distortions to the economy, and they're expensive, and they may be less sustainable than some other approaches. So, on the other hand, if you promote low-cost, quality daycare, and you emphasize early childhood education, these actually can have pronatal effects because it becomes easier to have children without giving up the high incomes that you would have while working. And they also offer benefits of human development. And so they also have good influences with respect to improved social equity. Focus on early childhood development is one of the big and important frontiers in economic development. We've touched on it before. We'll look at it in more detail later on in the course. So these are some of the policies that can be significant for addressing issues in population and development.